If you look around YouTube, you'd think Machiavelli was some kind of shallow business guru and pickup artist, offering advice on how to lie, cheat, and steal your way into power. Nothing could be further from the truth. You see, everyone lies about Machiavelli, including Machiavelli. On the surface, he appears to be a straightforward writer, using clear, well-explained historical examples to make his arguments. These examples often lead new readers astray. On a closer look, the reader discovers that each time Machiavelli presents an example, it is a partial, incomplete example. The incomplete examples are intentional, and they leave it open to the reader to ask if Machiavelli is really being honest. He presents a paradox. Machiavelli is known by his own works as a political advisor who upholds the virtue of fraud. He himself tells us he is a liar and a manipulator. So how can we trust our first impressions? And if we can't, then how should we approach Machiavelli? To understand The Prince, Machiavelli's most famous and deceitful work, we need to answer three questions. The first is the simplest. Who was Niccolò Machiavelli? Where and when did he live, and what was his role in that historical context? What were the major events that shaped his life? Once we have answered that question, we can turn to the central matter. Was Machiavelli a teacher of evil? Spoiler alert, if he was teaching evil, it was not the simple evil attributed to him by the legions of incel podcasters, who seem to think Machiavelli was writing a grindset self-help book for gaining power, whether in politics, business, or relationships. In fact, he did write that book, in the form of a satirical play called The Mandrake. So, we must ask if The Prince itself satirizes its own apparently serious advice. If it does, and Machiavelli did not teach evil, then we have to ask a third question. What was his political project? Given our knowledge of his historical context and his audience, what was Machiavelli really getting at? Let's get started. For ease of navigation, the video is divided into chapters below, with timestamps in the description. Machiavelli was born on May 3, 1469, in the Republic of Florence, to a citizen family of lawyers. His lineage was good, but his family was of modest means. The Florentine Republic nominally had a representative government. During Machiavelli's early life, that government was dominated by the House of Medici, under the rule of Lorenzo the Magnificent. After Lorenzo's death in 1492, Medici control over Florence rapidly deteriorated. By 1494, a mere 2 years later, Lorenzo's son, Piero the Unfortunate, was ousted from power and sent into exile. Machiavelli was 25. The circumstances surrounding Piero's ouster would have a lasting effect on the young Machiavelli's life, catapulting his political career while shaping his view of Florence's precarious political situation. The fall of Piero de' Medici was the direct result of the political rise of Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who preached against the corruption of the church and the decadence of Florentine civic life. Like Dante before him, and Martin Luther after him, Savonarola called for the repentance of the church for its constant meddling in worldly politics, and for a return to simplicity and contemplation in civic life. Savonarola was undoubtedly correct about the deep corruption of the church, which had caused its spiritual mission to be eclipsed by political ambition. Three sources of church corruption were particularly notorious. First, the proliferation of papal indulgences, in which the wealthy paid clergy to forgive their sins. In the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, indulgences were the church version of a money laundering and extortion racket, draining the nobility and merchant classes of funds to pay for new cathedrals, support the armies of the Papal States, and fund the decadent lifestyles of bishops, cardinals, and even the heads of monastic abbeys. Savonarola's criticism echoed that of the Florentine poet Dante Alighieri, who famously condemned Popes Nicholas III, Boniface VIII, and Clement V to the eighth circle of hell for their sale of indulgences and church offices. It was also a preview of another friar, the Augustinian Martin Luther, whose 95 Theses would be published in 1517 and kickstart the Protestant Reformation. Second, the regular appointment of purely political officials, often the second son of a noble house, to high-ranking church offices, many of whom had not even been ordained as priests, and still others who had taken vows only to ignore them upon taking office. The most famous example is Cesare Borgia, who was ordained as a deacon but not a priest, yet nevertheless became Archbishop of Pamplona and Tudela at age 15. The young Cesare was granted the additional Archbishopric of Valencia at 17, and finally named cardinal at 18. Apparently, if you wanted to advance in medieval church politics, it helped to have your father be the pope. In line with the designs of his father, Pope Alexander VI, after consolidating a political alliance with King Ferdinand of Spain, Cesare stepped down from the bishopric. His father immediately appointed him as gonfaloniere of the church, the commander of the armies of the papacy, which he used to support the Borgias' efforts to expand their territories in the Italian province of Romagna, during which period he would eventually meet a young Niccolò Machiavelli. Finally, Savonarola condemned church officials, including ordained priests and monastics who had taken their vows, yet routinely lived decadent lifestyles. In this, he was ironically prescient. One of the most egregious examples came a couple years after Savonarola left the political scene for good. In 1501, Pope Alexander VI hosted the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, an orgy hosted in Cesare Borgia's apartments in the Apostolic Palace. Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies at the Vatican, recorded the event in his Liber Notarum. On the evening of the last day of October 1501, Cesare Borgia arranged a banquet in his chambers in the Vatican with 50 honest prostitutes, called courtesans, who danced after dinner with the attendants, and others who were present, at first in their garments, then naked. After dinner, the candelabra with the burning candles were taken from the tables and placed on the floor, and chestnuts were strewn around, which the naked courtesans picked up, creeping on hands and knees between the chandeliers, while the Pope, Cesare, and his sister Lucrezia looked on. Finally, prizes were announced for those who could perform the act most often with the courtesans, such as tunics of silk, shoes, berets, and other things. No surprise, perhaps, that the Pope's bastard children nearly littered the countryside. Alexander VI is infamous for fathering more illegitimate children than any other pope. In calling such harsh attention to both the Medici and the Pope, Savonarola himself made too many enemies too quickly. He was excommunicated by Alexander VI on May 12, 1497, and Florence was threatened with a papal interdiction if they continued to harbor the heretic. Dependent as much of Renaissance Italy was on the Church for vital social and legal services, from baptisms and namings to weddings, funerals, and hospitals, such an interdiction would have proved disastrous for the city. By March of 1498, Florence capitulated and forced Savonarola to withdraw from public preaching. Making a final gambit, the friar claimed the ability to perform miracles. Fed up, the city put his claims to the test, scheduling a trial by fire for April. Savonarola delayed, and ultimately the trial was rained out, angering the crowd. By May, the Florentines stormed the Dominican monastery, and Savonarola and 2 of his monastic brothers were hanged from the gallows while fires were lit to consume their bodies. Savonarola had successfully exiled the Medici, but in angering the Pope as well, he lost his life. The vacuum of power left by the Medici's ouster and Savonarola's execution allowed the restoration of Florence's republican institutions, and a new government was elected under the leadership of the statesman Piero Soderini. Machiavelli was named as second chancellor of the Republic and secretary to the Ten of War, the committee responsible for diplomatic and military affairs. In today's terms, Machiavelli was a high-ranking bureaucratic functionary, working on issues of vital importance to Florence's diplomatic and military status. He did not rule directly, but he was ideally placed to advise and direct those who did. As a senior diplomat, Machiavelli knew many of the contemporary figures he describes in The Prince. He was sent on frequent diplomatic missions, including missions to negotiate with Countess Caterina Sforza, Siena's ruler Pandolfo Petrucci, King Louis XII of France, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and to the papal court at Rome, where he met the man who looms largest in his works, Cesare Borgia, and witnessed the election of the warrior Pope Julius II. Machiavelli was also a skilled military leader. Selected as chancellor to the Nine of the Militia in 1507, he accompanied Pope Julius II on his first campaign, and in 1509 he restructured the Florentine military to reduce its reliance on mercenary cavalry. The restructuring was a success, and Machiavelli used his locally mustered infantry to good effect, leading the Florentine capture of Pisa. Unfortunately for Machiavelli, the shifting fortunes and alliances of the Italian wars eventually doomed his career. In 1509, Piero Soderini took the side of France against the combined might of Venice, the Pope, the Spanish, and the Holy Roman Empire, a decision that would spell the end of his rule over Florence. The Spanish crushed the much smaller Florentine army in August 1512. The Pope replaced Soderini with Giuliano de' Medici, and in February 1513, Florence's leadership, including Machiavelli, were tried for conspiracy, tortured, and imprisoned. Machiavelli was fortunate. While Soderini and many others were executed, his friends intervened with the Medici on his behalf, and in March, his sentence was commuted to exile in the countryside. Much like his historical compatriot, Dante Alighieri, Machiavelli turned to literature to process his frustrations with Italian politics. A mere 4 months into his exile, he would draft The Prince. He also entered a literary discussion group and began writing the other work most central to his thought, the Discourses on Titus Livy. To Machiavelli, literature and history provided frameworks for understanding, and occasionally an escape, from the cruel reality of the present. As he writes in his letter to Vittori, a friend of whom he asked assistance in presenting the prince to Giuliano de' Medici, "On the coming of evening, I return to my house and enter my study. And at the door, I take off the day's clothing, covered with mud and dust, and put on garments regal and courtly. And reclothed appropriately, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them with affection, I feed on that food which only is mine and which I was born for, where I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions. And they in their kindness answer me, and for 4 hours of time I do not feel boredom. I forget every trouble. I do not dread poverty. I am not frightened by death. Entirely, I give myself over to them." How did a Republican statesman and fierce patriot, who was tortured and exiled from his native city by an authoritarian ruler, come to be seen as an immoral grifter, dedicated to nothing more than the pursuit of power? The belief didn't come out of nowhere. It largely comes from The Prince. Addressed to the new Medici rulers of Florence, The Prince is littered with apparently objective assertions that evil is, at bare minimum, a vital political tool for a successful ruler. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli takes pains to promote the value of cruelty over mercy, the importance of fear over love, and, perhaps most famously, to claim that rulers must make ample use of both force and fraud if they want to be successful. When pronouncing the value of evil, Machiavelli seems to be at his most honest. In arguably the most famous passage from The Prince, he argues a political ruler must make use of his beastly nature. You must know that there are two kinds of combat, one with laws, the other with force. The first is proper to man, the second to beasts. But because the first is often not enough, one must have recourse to the second. Thus, since a prince is compelled of necessity to know well how to use the beast, he should pick the fox and the lion, because the lion does not defend itself from snares, and the fox does not defend itself from wolves. So one needs to be a fox to recognize snares, and a lion to frighten the wolves. If this is Machiavelli's core teaching, then he is undoubtedly a teacher of evil, at least of the evil of necessity. As the most prominent modern translator of Machiavelli, Harvey Mansfield, explains in his introduction to The Prince, the essence of this politics is that you can get away with murder, that no divine sanction or degradation of the soul or twinge of conscience will come to punish you. The impression of evil is so strong that we must at least take it seriously, particularly since The Prince was intentionally different from what came before. The Prince was Machiavelli's take on an old genre, the mirrors for princes genre, pioneered by Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, Plato's Republic, Cicero's De Officiis, and Seneca's De Clementia. Where many other works in the genre lecture rulers on the importance of morality and natural law, on the state of a ruler's soul, Machiavelli alone nakedly proclaims how overtly evil acts help maintain power. On the other hand, Machiavelli himself famously points to the tension between his surface teachings and his examples. In Chapter 6 of The Prince, he tells us he will teach with the greatest examples. Yet the examples he gives are often incomplete, and their omissions often contradict Machiavelli's proclaimed lessons. Why? Was Machiavelli simply a sloppy historian? It's possible, but unlikely. Leo Strauss, ironically the most vocal proponent of taking Machiavelli's evil seriously, put it like this: Machiavelli's work is rich in manifest blunders of various kinds. Misquotations, misstatements regarding names or events, hasty generalizations, indefensible omissions, and so on. It is a rule of common prudence to believe that all these blunders are intentional. The simplest case of a manifest blunder is the author's self-contradiction, and especially self-contradiction on one and the same page. How does this self-contradiction work in practice? Let's consider the lion and fox example, which is a direct allusion to Cicero's De Officiis, where the Roman statesman addresses injustice. While wrong may be done, then, in either of two ways, that is, by force or by fraud, both are bestial. Fraud seems to belong to the cunning fox, force to the lion. Both are wholly unworthy of man, but fraud is the more contemptible. Both Strauss and Mansfield emphasize this passage in their interpretations of Machiavelli's evil teachings. Others, myself included, disagree with their approach. If Cicero were the only allusion for this passage, or if Machiavelli's analysis stopped there, then Mansfield's assessment of Machiavelli's evil would be the obvious and correct interpretation. But, as Strauss himself argued, Machiavelli's examples are never so simple. Machiavelli continues the discussion later in the same paragraph. Nor does a prince ever lack legitimate causes to color his failure to observe faith. One could give infinite modern examples of this, and show how many peace treaties and promises have been rendered invalid and vain through the infidelity of princes, and the one who has known best how to use the fox has come out best. At first glance, this seems a simple restatement of his argument, but in actuality it is a nod to a second and more recent historical allusion to the fox and lion, one made by Machiavelli's older compatriot in exile from Florence, Dante Alighieri. In Dante's Inferno, there is a famous reference to an Italian leader who was described as both fox and lion, the infamous Guido da Montefeltro. Guido was the Ghibelline ruler of Urbino, who was excommunicated in 1288 after losing to papal forces, only to be readmitted to the church a mere 8 years later, after which he became a Franciscan friar and was granted rulership of Montefeltro by the Pope. Dante imprisons Guido in the 8th circle of hell, among all those who gave false advice to princes. Speaking to Dante, Guido identifies himself. I was a man of arms, then wore the cord, believing that, so girt, I made amends, and surely what I thought would have been true, had not the highest priest, may he be damned, made me fall back into my former sins. And how and why, I'd have you hear from me. While I still had the form of bones and flesh, my mother gave to me. My deeds were not those of the lion, but those of the fox. Without knowing more, a reader might be tempted to say, so what, and interpret Machiavelli as tacitly rebuking Dante for his treatment of Guido. After all, Guido made apparently good use of fraud. But Guido's story is important, especially as it relates to the story of the highest priest he is referencing here, Pope Boniface VIII, who Dante also places in the 8th circle of hell. It was a story Machiavelli knew well, and it does not end well for Boniface or for Italy. In 1298, Boniface VIII was dealing with a controversy related to his succession to the papacy, which was viewed as illegitimate due to the forced abdication of his predecessor, Pope Celestine V, who held the papacy for a mere 5 months. Boniface sought the advice of Guido on how to deal with the Colonna family, who were leading the objections to his legitimacy, but were taking refuge in a fortress in Palestrina. Guido advised Boniface to promise the Colonnas amnesty, and then, once they were in his power, to execute them regardless. Boniface followed through on his advice, and followed it up by being a lion, razing both Colonna and Palestrina to the ground. Unfortunately for Boniface, the scheme backfired terribly. Some of the Colonnas escaped and went into exile, where they made common cause with the King of France, Philip IV, who sent an expedition into Italy that succeeded in capturing the Pope, who managed to escape only to die from the after effects of his captivity less than a month later. The incident led to the most humiliating period for the papacy in the Middle Ages, the Avignon papacy, a period of almost 70 years in which a series of 7 popes resided in France rather than in Rome, securely under the control of the French king. In other words, Machiavelli's grand example for the astute use of both force and fraud is none other than the greatest political failure in the history of the papacy. The omission is glaring, to say the least. Machiavelli tells us, through his letter to Vittori, that he read Dante on a nightly basis, and Machiavelli himself composed satirical poems and plays, often ridiculing the famous political figures of his time. If that were not enough, there is a striking parallel between the fall of Boniface and the fall of Machiavelli's most recent and prominent grand example, the leader of the papal armies, gonfaloniere of the church, Cesare Borgia. In Chapter 7 of The Prince, Machiavelli takes pains to portray Borgia as a skilled political leader, despite his ultimate failure. I do not know what better teaching I could give to a new prince than the example of his actions. And if his orders did not bring profit to him, it was not his fault, because this arose from an extraordinary and extreme malignancy of fortune. Borgia's job, given to him by his father, Pope Alexander VI, was to capture the Italian province of Romagna, and to eliminate all conspiracies that might exist against his person or that of the Pope. To this end, he appointed Ramiro de Lorca as governor, described by Machiavelli as a cruel and ready man, to whom he gave the fullest power. In a short time, Ramiro reduced it to peace and unity. Ramiro's brutal task complete, Borgia worried that his actions would generate hatred that would rebound onto Borgia's rule. So he promptly betrayed him. To purge the spirits of that people and to gain them entirely to himself, he wished to show that if any cruelty had been committed, this had not come from him, but from the harsh nature of his minister. And having seized this opportunity, he had him placed one morning in the piazza of Cesena, in 2 pieces, with a piece of wood and a bloody knife beside him. The ferocity of this spectacle left the people at once satisfied and stupefied. Such praise Machiavelli offers. And yet, it is irrefutable that Borgia failed, and worse, he failed for the same reason as Boniface VIII and Guido da Montefeltro. He made too many enemies and failed to maintain control over the papacy. Machiavelli takes pains to try to make the reader both realize and simultaneously dismiss the importance of this fact. He dedicates 3 entire pages at the end of the chapter to praising Borgia's virtue and blaming the entire papal succession on Borgia's untimely ill health, ultimately concluding, "But if at the death of Alexander the Duke had been healthy, everything would have been easy for him." Yet, as Boniface's failures led to the chaos of the Avignon papacy, in Borgia's failure lay the ultimate political disaster of Machiavelli's time. Giuliano della Rovera was selected as pope. He took the name Julius II, styling himself after Julius Caesar, and immediately went to war against Borgia's former province of Romagna, firing the opening salvo of the Italian wars. Once again, the great powers of Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were drawn into war in Italy. Once again, Italy's destiny was lost to her control, and Machiavelli the Patriot was imprisoned, tortured, and exiled to the countryside. And Machiavelli's audience, the Medici rulers of Florence, who owed their position to Borgia's failure, could hardly miss the irony. And if the Medici were foolish enough to miss the irony, and brought about their own fall through an excess of ambition, Machiavelli could only cheer at his enemy's misfortune. Yet, even if Machiavelli's sincerity is suspect, The Prince is still unlike previous examples in its genre, which leaves us with a further question. What was Machiavelli's political project? What was his goal in writing The Prince? The answer can be found in Machiavelli's inversion of his genre. The Mirrors for Princes takes as its project the goal of saving a ruler's soul from itself. The literature assumes a ruler will make use of his state for his own ends, and previous authors in the genre seek to mitigate this tendency through shifting the focus of the ruler to their own soul, encouraging them to pursue justice. Plato's Republic, structured as an extended dialogue with Plato's politically ambitious brother, Glaucon, is the most famous example today. Machiavelli, in his last chapter of The Prince, flips the script and tips his hand to his true goal. He does care about the soul, but it is not the soul of the ruler, it is the soul of Italy itself. To know the virtue of the Italian spirit, it was necessary that Italy be reduced to the condition in which she is at present. Without a head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, pillaged, and having endured ruin of every sort. Left as if lifeless, she awaits whoever it can be that will heal her wounds, and cure her of her sores that have festered now for a long time. In this, the final chapter of The Prince, Machiavelli declares his desperate desire for Italian unification. It is the soul of the Italian people that counts, and he will use any means at his disposal, regardless of its effect on the soul of the prince, to promote unification and stability. To drive home the point, The exhortation caps off 3 chapters about seeking wise advisors and avoiding flatterers. Yet Machiavelli quite deliberately ends the prince with a chapter engaged in the naked flattery of any prince who might pursue that unification project, promising them the eternal gratitude of the Italians and eternal glory throughout history. Why would Machiavelli do this? Many scholars argue that it has to do with his unique position towards his audience. Unlike many classical examples of the Mirrors for Princes, which were often written by a philosopher who had tutored the ruler as a child, Machiavelli was writing a job application to a new ruler who had been his political enemy. It is hardly surprising that an insecure exile and long-shot job applicant saw a need to butter up his potential employer. But I don't think that's all Machiavelli is doing. If you want to butter someone up, you don't want to make your insincerity too obvious. You want them to believe you. And yet, Machiavelli puts his ostentatious flattery immediately after his warning to avoid flatterers. Why would he be so obvious? If we think of the prince as a job interview rather than just an application, I think the reason is clear. Machiavelli wants to know something about his new employer. If he gets the job, he wants to be sure that he is advising a prince of a specific quality. And if the prince is inadequate, Machiavelli wants to know what kinds of errors he will make. Will he be too cautious, like Machiavelli's former ruler Piero Soderini? Or will he be too forceful, like Cesare Borgia? Whether Machiavelli remains an enemy or becomes an advisor, this is useful information for him to have. Aside from the need to protect his hide from a potentially vengeful new ruler, Machiavelli cares about Giuliano's qualities because he knows that different rulers are suited to different times, and he wants to move Italy from its current age of chaos into a new, stable, and ideally republican period. Machiavelli's love for republicanism is clearest in his other major work, the Discourses on Titus Livy, which will probably be the subject of a future episode here on the channel. But it is not entirely absent from The Prince. One hint comes from chapter 16, which deals with the uses of cruelty and mercy, and which deals especially with whether a prince should desire to be feared or loved. Famously, Machiavelli appears to come down on the side of the former, telling us that since men love at their convenience and fear at the convenience of the prince, a wise prince should found himself on what is his, not on what is someone else's. He should contrive to only avoid hatred, as was said. Machiavelli illustrates the argument with the example of a Roman general, Scipio Africanus, who famously defeated Hannibal and subjugated Carthage at the Battle of Zama, ending the Second Punic War. Machiavelli says that early in the war, Scipio faced rebellion from his armies in Spain, which arose from nothing but his excessive mercy, for which he was reproved in the Senate by Fabius Maximus, who called him the corrupter of the Roman military. The example leads us to believe that mercy is bad, and cruelty is a superior tool. Mercy creates fickle friends, while cruelty creates a steadfast subject. But by now, if you have been paying attention, you will suspect that this is not the entire story. And you would be right. Again, Machiavelli is emphasizing only half of his story, and he subtly de-emphasizes the other half. At the end of the same paragraph, Machiavelli tells us that while mercy would surely have undermined Scipio's reputation during the Roman Empire, it had the opposite effect during the Roman Republic. While he lived under the government of the Senate, this damaging quality of his not only was hidden, but made for his glory. After all, Scipio was acquitted by the Senate and went on to win the war and cement his legacy for all time. One way to understand this tension is that Machiavelli is making a careful, more considered point. In the context of instability and desperation, a prince must be cruel to prevent rebellion. Yet in a more stable context, that of a strong republic, such cruelty could rebound on its user, as the customs of republican governance would not permit wanton cruelty to go unpunished. What can lead to glory in one situation can lead to disaster in another. Scholars who emphasize this approach, especially Strauss and Mansfield, draw attention to Machiavelli's argument that true political virtue lay in working according to the shifting vicissitudes of fortune. Other scholars take a different approach and argue that Machiavelli sees principalities as inherently unstable. These scholars, led by Quentin Skinner and j.G.A. Pocock, base their view on the inspiration Machiavelli gave to later advocates of mixed government and constitutional limitations on the monarchy. One of the clearest statements of this inspiration comes from the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. While pretending to give lessons to kings, he gave great ones to the people. The Prince of Machiavelli is the Book of Republicans. I am more inclined toward the latter view. At a minimum, Machiavelli's end goal was the political renewal of Italy, ideally moving from the chaos of warring principalities into a stable, unified republic. Even just looking at the prince, the situation that allowed Scipio to gain glory out of mercy is far preferable to the state of affairs Machiavelli faced in the Italian wars. But those who read only lessons for republicans in the prince are also missing a part of the story, because those republics that existed in Italy were generally small, militarily weak, and fragile. Perhaps the sole local exception was Venice, which was notably defeated by Julius II in 1509, making Machiavelli's lifetime one of the most vulnerable periods of Venetian history. I am inclined to think that Machiavelli is taking his own advice on dealing with the vicissitudes of fortune. He sees two markedly distinct paths from chaos to stable republicanism. The first is through a stable republican regime, which due to its nature will only gradually expand its borders and must maintain a generally defensive mindset. The second is through a principality, but since principalities tend towards instability, any such path must be marked by aggressive expansion, with the hope that republican traditions can reassert themselves once unification succeeds. The topic of organizing and leading a republic is primarily the subject of the discourses, but Machiavelli gives us a couple hints in The Prince. One comes in Chapter 6, where he contrasts the two most recent nominally republican leaders of Florence, Savonarola and Soderini. On balance, he preferred the rule of Soderini, who tended towards excessive caution, to that of Savonarola, who impulsively made too many enemies without the military might to support his independence. Soderini's prudence, on the other hand, led to Machiavelli's reworking the Florentine military and a reduced dependence on mercenary arms. The importance of maintaining control over one's military is perhaps the one area where all commentators are in agreement. It is the subject both of Machiavelli's later The Art of War and of one of the least ambiguous statements in The Prince. I conclude, thus, that without its own arms, no principality is secure. Indeed, it is wholly obliged to fortune, since it does not have virtue to defend itself in adversity. All leaders must maintain their own arms, but lacking reliable allies, a small republic must depend on its own forces entirely, and exercise extra prudence. The situation is somewhat less clear for a prince, especially one with strong family connections. Maintaining their own arms is important, but given Machiavelli's praise for Cesare Borgia, it may not be the only path. What is more certain is that Machiavelli wants to encourage princes, if not republics, towards aggressive expansion. He does so out of a recognition that principalities, however well governed, are inherently unstable. The prince who can succeed at both expansion and establishing stable governments, what Machiavelli calls new modes and orders, is a rare creature. Far more common are those who have the military ability to expand aggressively, only to see their gains disappear as they age, or try to pass their empire on to a chosen successor. As usual, Machiavelli hides this conclusion, but it is hiding in plain sight. The key lies with one of his most extreme examples, Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse. Machiavelli discusses Agathocles in Chapter 8 of The Prince, the first place where he addresses the topic of cruelty and mercy. Of Agathocles alone, Machiavelli states, "Whoever might consider the actions and virtue of this man will see nothing or little that can be attributed to fortune." Agathocles, alone of all Machiavelli's examples, rose from poverty and achieved dominion over an empire, solely through the use of his own ability. Machiavelli immediately cautions us against the example. In a peculiar passage for such a blunt work of political realism, he seems to rebel against praising Agathocles. Yet one cannot call it virtue to kill one's citizens, betray one's friends, be without faith, without mercy, without religion. These modes can enable one to acquire empire, but not glory. One cannot attribute to fortune or to virtue what he achieved without either. Here, alone of all passages in The Prince, Machiavelli plays the coward, quailing from the spectacle of evil. Yet Agathocles succeeded. Machiavelli suggests it is because Agathocles used cruelty well. I believe this comes from cruelties badly used or well used. These can be called well used, if it is permissible to speak well of evil, that are done at a stroke. Those cruelties are badly used, which, though few in the beginning, rather grow with time than are eliminated. The irony is that Agathocles, who alone demonstrated perfect virtue and perfect evil, failed to secure his legacy. As Machiavelli tells the readers of the Discourses, he abdicated to a republican government on his deathbed. And that is Machiavelli's Trojan horse. The cruel, aggressive prince can unify Italy, but such a cruel prince will be his own undoing. He will achieve temporary empire, but not glory, and conspiracy will be his undoing. Agathocles is mirrored in the same chapter by Livaretto, who took similar actions in Machiavelli's time, but ultimately fell to the machinations of Cesare Borgia. And even Borgia, for all his virtues, was not secure. What lesson, then, for Giuliano de' Medici? Perhaps it can only be this. Please, dear Prince, make use of your armies and your allies to secure unification. Surely, though no one else has succeeded, you may accomplish this feat. But beware, though empire may be yours, it will be ephemeral, and only a stable, properly balanced, republican regime shall long endure.